This is the Good Government Podcast with Aaron Slutkin and Michael Hoffpauir.
Pamplemousse LaCroix is the drink of the day over here. You might be surprised to hear.
Is that your favorite flavor?
Yeah, pamplemousse is where it's at. I mean, there are some other ones that are all right, or it's pretty much pamplemousse or the guava. But they've got all these weird flavors, like limoncello is too sweet for me, the razzmatazz, all these crazy flavors. It's funny, what an industry. I mean, to watch what's happened in all of this, to say nothing of who was sitting around throughout all of recent history who said, you know, in about 5 years, money is going to be in making non-alcoholic cocktails and beers. And you go to bars and restaurants now and four different non-alcoholic beers. All these mocktails. You know, supposedly all these young kids don't drink anymore. Really worrying.
For the more expensive things on the menu, you know, at least they're reaching up to cocktail price. The new thing I've seen is bars are using non-alcoholic liquors. So there's this thing called seedlip. I think it's meant to imitate the taste of alcohol. My mother recently bought a non-alcoholic gin, which I have not tried. I just can't imagine it actually has that alcohol burn. And I know a lot of cocktails are structured to hide the burn. And of course, as you get up in quality, the burn is meant to go away. But it just doesn't seem how it could work.
I don't know. I mean, there are many mysterious things in this world, Aaron, and we'll just have to add this to the list. And foremost, it's one thing for me to say I don't understand how they make it. I don't understand why anybody would drink it. Spirit-forward drink without spirits doesn't make much. I'm just must confess I'm old-fashioned and like my old fashions to have brown liquor in them.
Yeah. Well, it serves a social function if you're trying not to drink but don't want to draw attention to yourself. Mm-hmm. You're taking a break that you don't want to advertise. You don't want to make it a subject of conversation. You don't want your sister to know you're pregnant.
Yeah.
But the names, if you go and order things, these names always indicate that they're mocktails. You know, can I have the zero proof?
Yeah.
What is that? Can I have the teetotaler? The names are not remotely subtle. Once I was out with a friend who, for one of these reasons, did not want to order an alcoholic drink, but did not want to draw attention to themselves. See, I use the gender neutral pronouns.
I noticed. I caught that.
We know all of the same people.
Yeah.
And so this person pointed to an item on the menu and said, "I'll have this," and probably would have gotten away because, you know, it's not as if drinks always have the easiest names to pronounce. And the waiter, who otherwise was a very good waiter, said, "Okay, the non-alcoholic one." Subtlety is a lost art.
Yeah, and that's a joke that we've seen in several movies. You know, somebody's checking out at a grocery store with an item that they would rather not have everyone know they're purchasing, and for some reason it doesn't scan, and they go on the mind. And it's, you know, what's actually funny. So this does segue into what we're going to talk about today. Oh, look at this, Aaron. Who saw this coming? Today we're talking about some double-digit Federalist Papers, at least Federalist 11, and we'll see how far we get. In these Federalist Papers, Publius is again speaking about the necessity of the Union, the utility of the Union, the goodness of the Union. What are the things Publius is ready to put an excise tax on? Booze.
Yeah.
Ardent spirits.
Yeah.
Syntax is what it's called. And it's worth pointing out, too, you learn this when you study Tocqueville. Professor Mansfield has pointed this out in some of his writings that I've read. Some of the oldest associations in America were associations meant to bring about temperance. So the conversation you and I are having about people drinking and not drinking actually is an old one in America. In democracy in America, these associations pop up repeatedly. And we're going to see Publius, I believe, what is it, Aaron? Is it Fed 12? Publius is going to say, yeah, look, and by the way, if this makes people buy less booze, you know, cool. It'll have a good moral effect. So, hey, look, we found a way into our conversation about the Federalist Papers today, Aaron.
Let me exploit a little bit. If we go to that section about taxes on alcohol, page 59 in our edition, this is the 12th paper. We're discussing ardent spirits and an excise tax, a consumption tax on alcohol. There is perhaps nothing, Publius says, so much a subject of national extravagance as this very article. The phrase national extravagance stands out in a series of papers where Publius is concerned with national security and additionally national greatness. We're not going to be confined to our small, minor republics that the Anti-Federalists seem more comfortable with. Instead, this is a series of papers on how, particularly 11, a series of papers on how a well-constructed union, to use that quote from Federalist 10, will help us achieve the great nation that certain things, whether it's geography, the American spirit, promise.
So yeah, let me ask you that question. So let me just say this just to get it out there. You should look at, I think one would do well to look at Federalist Papers 11, 12, and 13 as, of course, papers on the Union. In this case, they're papers on the Union and commerce. Commerce is the central subject of these. And what I wanted to ask you, Aaron, is what scale do you think Publius has in mind in these papers? Is Publius ready for America to be on the global commercial scene? Or is it to be small and isolated? Is America to go toe-to-toe with Britain? Why keep talking about the West Indies throughout these papers? What do you think about that? And did you find that surprising on this read-through? Publius's ambitions. Can I say it that way, Aaron? What do you think about that?
It's not clear. I think the question, at least as far as Federalist 11, ultimately boils down to how great our Navy needs to be. Do we have a Navy capable of waging war against the British or the French or one of the great empires on the sea? No, not necessarily. Actually, what we need is a Navy strong enough to be able to tip the balance in a wider European conflict, say between the British or the French. American neutrality has to be able to be enforced. A standing army actually isn't necessary because the Navy would be able to defend American coasts. But as much as the Atlantic is where a sphere of influence is necessary to separate ourselves from Europe, to not be the playthings of European power, to be able to, for example, protect American shipping and not necessarily project American might. It seems like his ambitions are also more continental. These papers are also about the American frontiers to the West. We can't forget that we had the Continental Congress in the decade previous to the drafting of the Constitution. I'm not sure whether, as the later generations of Americans would imagine, the boundary needs to be extended south into Mexico, or like some generations of America imagine, the current generation of Americans, north into Canada. But it does seem that the same principle that applies to creating a Navy and creating an American state that will be able to resist interference from European powers does necessitate expanding west toward the Pacific.
So now the extended sphere with which we became familiar in Federalist Papers 9 and 10 is defended on another level here in 11. This extended sphere is defended on the level of commerce. The wedge into the Navy is commerce. So Publius is not coming out here in Fed 11 rattling his saber. It's all about the adventurous spirit, as Publius says in paragraph 2 of Fed 11, of commercialism, this commercial spirit here. This is another way also of thinking about all of that providential language from Federalist Paper number 2. This promised land and how fertile the soil is, how navigable all the waters are. Okay, so that's another reason for union. And then that shows we're all here to make money, to work off this land. And guess what? When we do all this, we're going to want to use our own men, our own boats, no reliance on others. We're going to need to have a Navy to protect all of this shipping that's happening. If we become a maritime commercial power, we must become a maritime power, period. So that's what I was even thinking when I asked you that question. Boy, this big union got a lot bigger really quickly from what I was envisioning as we were reading Federalist Papers 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. Where it felt like the Union was creating a sort of wall around America. Now you realize, no, we're leaving, we're trading, we're shipping, we're importing. Now we've got a big Navy. It's really interesting. And golly, I got to point out that this is Hamilton, which I never do. You're wincing that I'm pointing it out, but here is economics, economic mindedness. This is another side of Publius that we're witnessing here. Whereas we saw the concerns with property in Fed 10, look at the way that the economics is working now in Fed 11. We're seeing a union of sentiment between all of these different interests, whether they be mechanic or agriculture. In these papers, Publius says, look, they're all going to realize that they have the same interests. So that means big union, controlled by federal government, Navy, controlled by federal government.
So the argument goes like this, I think. A adventurous spirit distinguishes the commercial character of America, and it makes Europeans uneasy. America is on the road to greatness, and he admits that is dangerous to Europe. We need a navy to be able to protect our commerce, particularly our naval commerce. We also need a set of uniform regulations on internal trade with America to be able to best exploit all of those navigable internal rivers, and also to facilitate commerce between the states that currently might have different, let's say, impost taxes or different regulations on trading. And then, because we need a strong navy, and I'm here in the 6th paragraph, a vigorous national government also is necessary.
Yeah, so it's a matter of policy now. A vigorous national government, so that means it has energy, but it also has to have wise policy. Prudence comes to the fore. In those single-digit papers, I almost got the impression that all we needed was union, and then things would be okay. But as Publius argues in the previous paragraph, that's adventurous spirit of commerce, way back in Fed 7, would have made for disaster if we didn't have union. And now here in Fed 11, that same adventurous spirit, what I'm calling the adventurous spirit of commerce, is good. It's good as long as we have union, this sort of commercial-minded policy, and a navy. The passion persists, and Publius is channeling it, working with it.
And I have to admit, I was not excited when I saw the heading of this paper, the utility of the union in respect to commerce and a navy. I mean, I was not an economics major for a reason. But I found myself fairly enchanted by this argument, I think because Publius so subtly presents us only two options. One is greatness, the other is impotence. Necessity requires that Americans have a strong navy to be able to prevent European interference, to be able to protect our merchants. But the same principle, a strong union necessary to build a navy, uniformity of regulations to be able to promote interstate commerce, actually is the thing that is going to produce greatness. So while we protect our commerce and do the most basic things that a government can do, we will be able to become a state that is reasonably dangerous to the European powers. Now, why is that? I think one of the things this paper asks us to do is to inquire into the causes of American greatness. And I'm here reminded of a geography textbook I was once tasked to teach that said that if a country was great, if a country was rich, it had nothing to do with the country's culture. It didn't say what it had to do with, but it left, I think, systems of government and geography. And here, it doesn't seem that Publius thinks the type of regime is actually important. A vigorous national government is necessary, and we know we can have a vigorous national government of different types. And then geography, but certainly culture plays a part. We Americans have an adventurous spirit. Americans have friendship between the different parts. Americans have different economic interests, which can be harmonized. We have an unequaled spirit of enterprise, which signals the genius of the American merchants and navigators. Let me just read this. I think this puts the cap on what I've been saying. That unequaled spirit, this is in paragraph the 7th, that unequaled spirit of enterprise, which signalizes the genius of the American merchants and navigators, and which is in itself an inexhaustible mine of national wealth, would be stifled and lost, and poverty and disgrace would overspread a country which with wisdom might make herself the admiration and envy of the world. Do you want to be divided, impotent, poor, or do you want to be great? Do you want to be a rival to Europe with all of the benefits of geography, the large moat of the Atlantic, the glories of this continent in water or in land. What is it do you want? And Publius really is very clear. You have to pick. If you do not choose this union, you'll be infighting, you'll be reduced to poverty. But if you choose the union, then greatness is promised.
Well, I think that there's so much in these two paragraphs, and I really appreciate the point you're making. It seems as if Publius is continuing to offer solutions to the problems of faction, and commerce is coming in and doing that, right? I mean, I want to go back to the previous paragraph to piggyback on what you've just said. All of this here, Publius says, commerce is itself what's going to help us see our way through another sort of internal faction. So this point isn't as exciting as the one you just made, Aaron, but it does show that something of that Montesquieuian spirit of commerce, overcoming the differences between people or smoothing over mores. We see here Publius offering us this too. So in that paragraph that begins under a vigorous national government, it's the 6th paragraph in our edition, we can see that taking away the motive for majority faction was something that we were trying to consider doing in Fed 10. Well, here we show that we are strong and that the jealous efforts of Europe won't work. And if they can see that their efforts won't work, they're not even going to try. So there's another way of, why not think about faction on all of these levels, or strife on all of these levels, and see that Publius is doing the same. Now, all of this grand picture that opens us to grand statesmanship even here, as this paper ends, notice the way that Publius limits himself, though. He's self-limiting in this. He says, hey, it's just a newspaper. I can't really say that much here. It's a newspaper conversation, so there's stuff that he won't discuss. But nonetheless, as Mr. Lucchese has pointed out in his recent article on Fed 11, which I trust you read, Aaron, this ends with a call, a peroration. I'm going to just read from the tail end. It belongs to us, says Publius, to vindicate the honor of the human race and to teach that assuming brother, Europe's, moderation. Union will enable us to do it. Disunion will add another victim to his triumphs. Let Americans disdain to be the instruments of European greatness! ! Let the 13 states bound together in a strict and indissoluble union concur in erecting one great American system, superior to the control of all transatlantic force or influence, and able to dictate the terms of the connection between the old and the new world. What an ending here. What a call. Strength through labor, strength through union, strength through commerce as a product of our labor, and then the Navy as well. It seems to be still this concern over security and safety, which is the horizon of so many of these papers in the beginning. And yet it's lifted up as well, because now there's a sort of nascent patriotism here. The American system is superior. We're better than they are. We're capable of doing all of this ourselves, and Europe's going to want the product of our labor, which is our own. It's ours.
Yeah, and on top of that, strength through a superior, I guess, national disposition, the United States is capable of teaching Europe moderation, teaching it to be less assuming. And as far as American ambitions go, we can think here Publius or Hamilton or whatever you want to call him. And maybe we can say his career in the 1790s after the ratification of the Constitution does matter here. But his ambitions are not necessarily to create an empire. I don't think we're supposed to think of Americans projecting power into the West Indies as the British or the French did. I don't think he is imagining that we are going to create an empire beyond our Western borders. Moderation can be, and I guess here it hinges on what our definition of moderation is it teach Europe to be, Publius says, less assuming, to think less of her own superiority, or is it to tame her passions for expansion? I think I can see both interpretations here, because Publius divides the world into 4 parts, and he says Europe has in different degrees extended her dominion over them all. Publius doesn't seem to want to exchange Europe for America there, where America will take the place as an imperial world leader. Rather, I think Publius is looking for the ability to, through a strong navy, treat the Atlantic as a firm barrier between Europe and America, something like a proto-Monroe Doctrine, and then to be able to let America prosper with a strong internal and international commerce.
And look at the rhetoric that's pulling this off. If you even go up a handful of lines from where I last read, at the tail end of Fed 11, and I wanted to ask you about whether or not you think our dogs bark more loudly, equally loudly, or less loudly than British dogs. And we can talk a little bit about why Publius is saying this here. But this is, again, still the ultimate paragraph in Fed 11. The superiority she has long maintained has tempted her to plume herself as the mistress of the world and to consider the rest of mankind as created for her benefit. Men, admired as profound philosophers, have in direct terms attributed to her inhabitants a physical superiority, and have gravely asserted that all animals, and with them the human species, degenerate in America, that even dogs cease to bark after having breathed a while in our atmosphere. Facts have too long supported these arrogant pretensions of the European. It's wonderful. So much of this is, some French guy was making these arguments running around, and Jefferson, of course, took up his measuring utensils and points this out throughout passages and notes on the state of Virginia. Goes around and weighs cows, measures horses. He takes a survey of what's going on with crops in America and resources in America to say, look, there is not something degenerate going on these shores, and therefore there's nothing superlative or superior going on those shores. That's what Jefferson does. But what you can see Publius do here is say, we're actually going to get to work and prove all of this to be mere hubris on their part. This is by no means dry logic. This is not just boring economics. There is a thumatic argument here meant to stir some everlasting hatred of the Brits, some desire to be free, especially to be free to labor, to do what you want and to have money, and then to have people, trade with people as you wish. That's brought up here at the end of it. So it's a funny ending that I think is really important to pay attention to. Now, Publius is not some natural philosopher. He's not going to worry about that. He concedes that, sure, America might not be as good as they are, as Britain is, as Europe is, but it belongs to us to vindicate our honor, but not just our honor, the honor of all humans. All humans here. So it's really universal, a much more universal argument, I think. And so union is how we can overtake it, how we can overcome these mean old Brits. Act honorably, prove that we aren't barkless dogs. Honor requires, as you were pointing out to me, Aaron, something of moderation. To act honorably requires us to be taught something about moderation by Publius, not cows being as fat as cows in England, not about how loudly our dogs bark or don't. The Union, and I would add the Constitution, it's a product of us, and also our politics and policy, should show Europe our greatness, our honorableness. And so therefore, Publius throws before us the gauntlet. There's a claim of honor here. Are you going to now act so as to own up to this honor? We can't just rely on the providence that Publius discussed in Fed 2. It's not natural blessings alone that are going to suffice. Yeah, we have to make ourselves enterprising, but also self-governing by way of having an energetic government and even a navy in our own land to claim this honor rightly. I don't know. It's funny to read this paper and just go, man, this is kind of boring. Especially the title, which suggests it's boring. And then at the end, there's some stirring rhetoric. Now, from this height, we're going to continue to talk about things that we would rather not talk about, namely taxes and revenue in Fed 12. But before we switch to Fed 12, Aaron, anything else you want to make sure to note?
No, I just think when in American history I take up with my students the 1990s, it seems that we're fading from the exciting scenes of the American Revolution toward the also exciting scenes of building a national government, then they can study the foundations of our politics today. And then it seems all of a sudden now we're talking about banking, and Washington fades into the background as arguments about constitutionality and about finance come in. But I think this paper seems to at least for me vindicate why commerce and finance were such important spheres of argument in the early republic. It wasn't just about how to make commerce run more fluidly, how to let's say in modern terms decrease transaction costs in the United States. It really is an argument about what kind of nation America will be.
Yeah.
I'm always remember, Mike, when I heard you teach about the American founding, you always ask the question, what do you Americans want to be when you grow up? What kind of people do you want to be? What attributes do you want to have? What do you want your relations to other powers to be? And commerce is clearly such an important beginning in all of this. In the past, we've looked at different papers and said, okay, this one sounds like Hobbes to me, and this one sounds like Locke to me. This one sounds like Montesquieu. Who are you hearing here? Who's in the background? Is it Smith? Is it Montesquieu?
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's a great question. And I've already pointed out that this sounds like some Montesquieu to me. But what I'm hearing here is Publius. And I imagine some historian of ideas would rush in to correct me. But in terms of the way that union is now being viewed, it's one thing to sit back and talk about commerce in this way. But Publius is here doing comparative politics when he's thinking about Britain time and time again in this paper. And he's also thinking about America in its unique circumstance. And what union in America will mean for its commerce, and then all that it has to draw on in building its navy and importing and exporting goods. So that's my answer. That's one of the reasons why I did admit Hamilton wrote this. This is through and through Hamilton. But it is Publius at the same time. I have no reason to think that Madison would disagree with this at this point. I see no reason to think he would. I mean, here's why I can make that argument to you. Look at the opening sentence of the second paragraph of Federalist Paper number 12. A prosperous commerce is now perceived and acknowledged by all enlightened statesmen to be the most useful as well as the most productive source of national wealth. Well, who doesn't want national wealth? So much so, Publius goes on to say, and has accordingly become a primary object of their political cares. Well, you're an enlightened statesman, aren't you? Well, I'm going to act like I am one. And so Publius here yet again says, look, everybody agrees. What are you going to say? You're not enlightened? I mean, it's one of those questions you can't get out of. You know, a question I was just thinking of. And here Publius wants to say, this is something in the water. Everyone agrees. All enlightened statesmen know, or at least now understand, the usefulness of commerce. So while commerce might be depreciated in the following paragraph, namely, everyone, all human beings, are overrun or overtaken by it, Publius is still nonetheless here arguing for commerce and work ethic as something that are essential to national wealth, and national wealth is essential to national security. So they're all right here. So much so that Publius is now showing us interests which were irreconcilable back in Fed 10 are now reconciled, I would say, here in Fed 12. So it is commerce and agriculture are easy bedfellows, it appears, here in Fed 12. The manufacturers in Fed 10, I'm not sure where they went. They're not here fighting with anybody. It's just commerce and agriculture can go together. They're mutually beneficial. Those manufacturers who are a problem in Fed 10 are not mentioned here. Maybe the silence is deafening, you would say, but I can only point out this is a component of his argument. America and its large numbers of farmers who are land rich and crop rich at this time, but they're not money rich. And what we can see is that these large number of poor farmers in America, when they interact with their state and local governments, are pretty much like trying to get blood from a stone. The state and local governments cannot collect taxes from these money poor farmers. It seems that roughly 95% of America at this time was farmers. So there's no cash floating around. So how do you pay taxes if there's not just a bunch of people sitting on a bunch of cash? When we add that there's a widespread popular aversion, which Publius references here, to paying taxes, that although you can constitutionally tax, perhaps, you won't be able to collect it. The people don't want to pay it, and they also don't have any money to give you. So no head tax, but it seems like excise taxes, which we'll see here as a tax on certain liquors, or sales taxes or import taxes are your only options. We'll need to tax revenue. Without this, we'll sink into a bad condition of something like a province.
Yeah, there's an argument that any struggling state would do well to recognize, which is that tax laws have to reflect an economic reality and also the culture of a people. He says in paragraph 6, the genius of the people will illy brook the inquisitive and peremptory spirit of excised laws.
Mhm.
Interestingly, right, it's not just people who have spirits, but tax laws have spirits. But also there is the economic reality that you reflected of the land-rich, cash-poor farmers. The pockets of the farmers, on the other hand, will reluctantly yield but scanty supplies. From this, he draws an economic or political law. If these remarks have any foundation, that state of things which will best enable us to improve and extend so valuable a resource must be the best adapted to our political welfare. Our political welfare can only be tended to by a real knowledge of the sort of, I'm afraid of using a modern term, but the socioeconomic realities of the country in the fullest sense, the realities of what people have, what they possess, what can be taxed, but also and only a knowledge of the people that can be gained from study of history or from acquaintance with public affairs, but also knowing what they will or will not tolerate. And we can imagine the cagey, even still today. I talk about this with my students. Even today, the caginess with which our leaders might tax us, knowing our origins as a country founded in part through a tax rebellion.
Mhm. Mhm.
Of course, even while he's drawing these universal laws about taxation, he says in the next sentence that from the one I read, and it cannot admit of a serious doubt that the state of things must rest on the basis of a general union. And why is that? We'll have a uniformity of regulations, a uniformity of duties. We're no longer going to have the states impost taxes. And a union will be able to facilitate commerce, to encourage free trade in a way that will make the farmers more cash rich, that will lead to the distribution of currency more widely.
I agree completely with you. Taxes have to be from commerce, for if not, agriculture is going to pay for everything. And we've just gone through the difficulties of making that happen. What do you mean pay for it? We don't have any money. We're land rich and crop rich and cash poor. So agriculture should want commerce to thrive, so it won't get overtaxed. That means that agriculture should want union. That means America should want union. Union would make for a robust economy wherein commerce flourishes and forms something of a tax base. Now, you're going to point out port cities are going to be different, that they have different interests in different areas. But it seems here that the tax Publius wants to pay most attention to, it's the one that you and I began with. That's up in what is paragraph 11 of our edition here in Fed 12. The liquor tax. Not only will money come in, but it'll also have a salutary effect. Let's read it. This is page 59, Federalist Paper number 12. The single article of ardent spirits under federal regulation might be made to furnish a considerable revenue. According to the ratio of importation into this state, the whole quantity imported into the United States may, at a low computation, be estimated at 4 millions of gallons, which at $1 per gallon would produce 200,000 pounds. That article would well bear this rate of duty, and if it should tend to diminish the consumption of it, such an effect would be equally favorable to the agriculture, to the economy, to the morals, and to the health of society. there is perhaps nothing so much a subject of national extravagance as this very article. This is so good we read it twice, Aaron. The agriculture, the economy, the morals, and the health of society. So syntax through and through is where we should go. It's a good that you're consuming. You're going to pay more for it. And if you don't want to, and people do it less, it'll have a salutary effect. Most likely he's thinking about rum here. Maybe it's bourbon. We see Brutus worry about this a little bit too in one of his anti-federalist papers, but it's morally good. So it's good. So this is not any sort of libertarian view, broadly speaking. This shows that the Federalist Papers are interested in our moral health. This is not just full boogie, full throttle, wide open commercial spirit. There still is something else going on here. I just read the paragraph to you. Federalist Papers are interested in something like social conservatism. Morals are cited specifically here. Later, we're going to see in the Federalist Papers something like a carriage tax. It's pretty funny. It's a tax on the buggy. But we even have this today. I mean, look at the way that we do this. One of my favorite / least favorites, the gas guzzler tax.
Yeah.
So you want to go buy some, well, you can't really get them anymore, but a Dodge Viper or something like this with an amazing engine. Yeah, you're going to pay a gas guzzler tax on these things. And so it's something that America has been doing for some time, and whether or not we're right or wrong about the morality or immorality of the consumption of large quantities of rum, I leave it for you to decide. The point is that Publius is very much concerned.
There's an argument here for kind of lowercase p progress. I know that word progress, especially when it's unclear whether we're talking about an historic idea of progress, can carry connotations that make discussion of it uncomfortable. But I'm reminded of this at an event with the Fund for American Studies recently. We were reading Bill Buckley's opening statement for National Review. He says that over-government regulation makes real progress impossible, and it's real lowercase p progress, helping us distinguish even more that this is lowercase p progress. And I think it means something like commerce, something like the union as a means to national greatness. And here it does seem that, to use another ugly term, social engineering is part of it as well. Like you said, this is not a libertarian formula for government. This is using governmental means to help stamp out a behavior that Publius thinks is injurious to the health of the American people, and extravagance as well. I'm curious what you make of that term here. He does talk about the health of society, but there also seems to be this concern about people are spending money in a way that is unproductive. We really are striking right at the habits of Americans. And I don't want to just think about Americans, because you said bourbon, in the backwoods of a state yet to be formed called Kentucky. Washington had on his plantation a whiskey distillery.
Nice.
To try to deal with all this excess wheat that he was growing on his farm. It's you can think about it. If you think about scale and the cost and difficulty of storing different kinds of grains, whiskey becomes popular in America partly because it's just so much easier to store liquid than it is to store dry goods. I'm having a little too much fun here, but extravagance. What do you make of that?
I mean, who's against extravagance? At the same time, it's appealing to our desire for commercial gain. I mean, so that's what's so weird. He's playing on our desire for affluence while also talking about our moral health. And this is occurring in a backdrop of concern over safety. So it's still safety to have a government that's going to take care of you by way of at least union, so you're not tearing each other apart. Commerce is going to make it where we can pay for all of this to keep you safe. And then guess what? Once all this commerce happens, everybody's going to be more prosperous, but not so prosperous to where they engage in morally deleterious behavior. I mean, that seems to be the argument here. Well, why would he need to make that last appeal? 12. So let's turn to 13 and think about frugality or efficiency there against the backdrop of extravagance here in 12.
Should we move on to number 13?
Yeah, I think so. And I only have a few things that I'd like to discuss about 13. Namely, the advantage of the union regarding our economy is that it's a cheaper way to govern. it's cheaper to have one united government of these 13 states than to have 3 separate chunks. The discussion is really funny here. Whereas I said, Publius is not engaged in a sort of natural science. I said, that's Jefferson who's running around measuring cows and stuff like that. But here, 13, you feel something like physics going on, something of natural science. There's a sort of force at work here. Once we get to a scale of the union across all 13 states, the economics of scale kick in. So reproducing the government in 3 different ways is going to make for worse economics. The economy of scale is going to be hindered if you had 4, 4, and 5 states respectively. But one big old union wherein all 13 states are combined, it's going to keep the size of administration down and be more efficient. This is something like Publius's improved political science at work that was not announced in Fed 9 when we saw enlarging the orbit. Announced. So Fed 13, I read as answering the anti-federalists' charge that the union is expensive. Publius is saying, no, it's less expensive. And through it, because it's less expensive, we can now get something of frugality as a virtue at work. And maybe this is what you were pointing at in the previous paper with this extravagant stuff. The anti-feds are the ones who are going to be extravagant and wasteful. It's the feds, through their more efficient government, economically speaking, because of the union, who are frugal.
So I'm interested whether you think his comment about mechanics and dimensions and magnitudes, I'll read it in a second, answers a claim of Brutus in his first paper that a expansive republic, because of the necessities of projecting power into the frontier, and let's imagine he's thinking to the Mississippis or the Rocky Mountains, or possibly even to the South Sea, as he might have called it, the Pacific, that the government that is capable of administrating there is a government equally capable of using that same amount of force on New York, where right now the national capital is, or on Maryland beside Washington, D.C. Publius says this is not a reply. It's in the same. I'm not sure it's a reply. It may be, and maybe you can tell me so. But I don't know if I'm satisfied. This is in the first paragraph in the middle. When the dimensions of a state attain to a certain magnitude, it requires the same energy of government and the same forms of administration which are requisite in one of much greater extent. So there's a point maybe of, I guess, diminishing returns for investing in state capacity. He says, now, this doesn't admit of precise demonstration. We cannot make a rule of it in the same way that we can make rules in physics, but when we reflect upon the degree of authority required to direct the passions of so large a society, Great Britain he's referring to, which is about the size of the smaller confederacies he imagines America might break up into, of so large a society to the public good, we shall see no reason to doubt that the like portion of power would be sufficient to perform the same task in a society far more numerous. I guess the idea, and even now as I hear myself read it out loud, thinking maybe he is answering, Brutus's reply is, actually, the amount of national power it takes to be able to administer the frontier actually is the same amount of power it takes to get from, let's say, the capital of the Southern Confederacy in South Carolina to the frontiers of the Southern Confederacy in Virginia. And so, if that's true, why are you worried about an extensive republic when you've already created what is, in mechanical terms, in terms of the amount of power necessary for good government? He does not use that phrase, an extensive republic. It's the same amount of force necessary.
And you should add to it, since it's now officially time to kick the anti-feds while they're down, any of concern about the anti-feds saying, look, they have all this power to tax, and they're going to come in and regulate commerce, and they're going to take stuff from you and use the military to take it from you. There's not an adequate, in those early Brutus papers at least, consideration of Publius's arguments here regarding how commerce is going to be accentuated through union. And so it's not going to be trying to get blood from a stone. It's creating new markets through commerce, through the union. Yeah, all this language here. Civil power is discussed here. And what you just read to us, properly organized and exerted, is capable of diffusing its force to a very great extent. It's another way of saying how inefficient the small governments are. The argument you just made, Aaron. The smaller governments require that much power, therefore it's wasted. The power is consumed by the government, exerted by the government in these smaller, let's say 5-state big confederacy. It's wasted because it could take that same amount of power and extend it over all 13 states. So any argument against extravagancy for something like you and I would call efficiency is what's at work here. What's this line about the Flanders of America at the end of paragraph 2? Do you know what this is?
I'm thinking of Belgium being overrun constantly in the Franco-Prussian War, in the First World War. Just the stomping ground for the greater powers who ravage it. At this point, we're talking about where Pennsylvania would go in a breakup of the Union into smaller confederacies. And the answer is she'll go wherever she seems most likely not to be the boundary between conflicts. It's the same principle that leads the middle states, excluding Virginia, to not pick a side during the war. The hope that they will not be the front or the center of the conflicts. One thing I do think is worth noticing about number 13 is Republican government is not going to rescue these smaller confederacies from tyranny from the center. It doesn't seem that regime type matters at all to Publius here. We are talking about the dimensions of a state. We are not talking about the dimensions of a republican state or a monarchical state. A certain amount of power is necessary, as he says. A certain degree of authority is required to direct the passions of so large a society. And here he is talking not about the Union, but about the smaller confederacies. And Republican government will not save these smaller confederacies from the necessities of exercising an amount of power that Publius argues, and I think convincingly, is equivalent to the amount of power or authority that a national union, well constructed, would direct. So what do you want?
And Fed 13, where are the arguments that we would have seen from the earlier papers regarding the problems of not having union regarding internal conflict? You know, if you just go back to Fed 6 concerning dangers from war between the states. So Publius is looking at the same subject in terms of the economy now. If we combine it, though, with the earlier arguments, we see how absolutely nasty the alternative is, economically speaking, and in terms of security as well. So for Publius, security and economic security, it seems to me, are hand in glove through these papers. You want one, you're going to get the other, because the solution is union. Representative government, too, as we saw as one of the ways of controlling the effects of faction in Fed 10. But that's the arguments here, it seems to me. And
Yeah.
look at how he ends Fed 13. It's a long sentence. If, in addition to the consideration of a plurality of civil lists, we take into view the number of persons who must necessarily be employed to guard the inland communication between the different confederacies against illicit trade, and who in time will infallibly spring up out of the necessities of revenue, and if we also take into view the military establishments, which it's been shown would unavoidably result from the jealousies and conflicts of the several nations, so that's taking us back to Fed 6 and so forth, into which the states would be divided, we shall clearly discover that a separation would be not less injurious to the economy than to the tranquility, commerce, revenue, and liberty of every part. So the closing paragraph of Fed 13 does take us back and say, look, everything's going to fall apart, and you're going to be just in war. So you can be in war and dead, or alive and poor, or you can go with union. And this is how it is that you're going to be prosperous, have a government that's not wasteful in the way that he's laid out. You're going to have tranquility and commerce and revenue, and most importantly, liberty. I mean, all this talk of commerce, we haven't talked about liberty, but that's what's there, right? Isn't that the precondition of all of this? Labor, as far as he's been talking about it and thinking about it. I'm not being forced to labor for the good of some king or queen, But for myself, who's choosing to live under this government, created in such a way where the taxes can be this burdensome, but not that burdensome.
Yeah, and I think the flow of the papers matches this. We looked at the blessings secured to the American people by the Revolution. We talked about how the Union will help us preserve our national security from foreign powers. We talked about how the Union will be able to preserve our internal security from civil war and from insurrection. Then in number 9 and number 10, we learned how these improvements in political science, particularly in number 10, the enlargement of the orbit and representation, will be able to secure our liberties from factions. And now we've just learned about how the Union will be conducive to commerce, which, again, the argument is not simply about commerce. It's about, because of our adventurous spirit and the other blessings we talked about in 2, it's about the national greatness within our grasp. It's all here. These first 14 papers, as we've alluded to before, are about union primarily. And as we reach the end, we see how much is at stake in our discussion of the necessity of a well-constructed union.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And as we move into 14, we're going to see language about kindred blood and mingled blood regarding our sacred rights. And so at the end of the day, it is still, it's about American greatness, but as it's being defined here, as we saw in the earlier paper, it's about human dignity. And that human dignity, that's denying the superiority of the Europeans, of the Brits in particular, and the inferiority of the air in America and the livestock in America and the Americans. Well, we're fighting for greatness, but our greatness is not to be seen in our superiority as a different species, but it's rather as something that's a product of a recognition of the fact that we're all the same species. So liberty is still something on Publius's lips throughout these papers. You need security in order to have liberty. It's not just security because I'm afraid of dying, but it's security also so then I may have liberty to do what I choose to do. So I think there's something wonderful going on in these papers that reminds me, maybe it's just when you're a hammer, everything's a nail, but that reminds me of the Declaration of Independence. And that I still see concerns over humans' ability to pursue happiness and the justice of that ability to pursue their happiness being rooted in the equality of human beings, a denial of the notion that just because you're in Britain, your dogs bark louder, or you're a superior human being. And so to echo the statements you're making, so now we've got to prove it. That's hearkening back to the call of Fed 1. Do it and prove it and choose well. Well, Aaron, man, it's been great talking with you about the Fed papers.
Yeah, really am delighted with how much we were able to learn from these papers.
Yeah.
Again, I did not hide my concern that we were going to be reading turgid economic tracts. And of course, we learn when we discuss these that Federalist is so much more than a bland commentary on government or a set of political pamphlets. Here, we really saw that the heart of this is about national and possibly, as you suggest, personal flourishing.
Well, thanks, Aaron. Great talking to you. Look forward to talking to you again soon.
Yeah, take care, Mike.
This has been the Good Government Podcast with Aaron Slutkin and Michael Hoffpauir.